Get this trash out of my sight before I have security drag her out by her hair. Captain Marcus Miller didn't just speak. He spat the words. His face twisted in a mask of pure contempt. With a swift, brutal motion, he grabbed the worn leather notebook from Maya's hands and hurled it across the hangar. It skidded through a puddle of black grease, the pages curling instantly stained by the filth of the floor. A black woman's intuition isn't engineering Maya. It's a fairy tale, he sneered, looming over her. You honestly think your little notes can fix what my elite team can't stick to the mop bucket, sweetheart? That's the only place a black woman like you will ever hold any power around here. Maya stood frozen, her eyes stinging, but Miller wasn't done. He stepped closer, leaning down until his voice was a cold, jagged whisper against her ear. Look at your hands, Maya. They're stained with the grime of your station. Don't you dare think for a second that you're anything more than a glorified janitor in this hangar. He didn't know it yet, but that notebook held the secret to a problem that had stumped 50 of the world's finest minds. Don't miss this story of justice. Where are you watching from? Comment your location and local time below. If you believe talent has no color, subscribe for more. The Edwards Air Force Base was a sprawling monument to American aerospace dominance, a vast expanse of scorched concrete and steel reflecting the relentless California sun. Inside Hangar 12, the atmosphere was suffocating, not just from the heat, but from the crushing weight of failure. Sitting on the raised hydraulic stands shrouded in shadow and silence was the X-99 Valkyrie, the pride of the United States military, a next-generation stealth fighter worth $120 million. Now it was nothing more than a grounded multi-ton paperweight. Maya Lawson stood at the edge of the hangar floor, clutching a standard-issue gray mop. She was technically a senior aviation technician, a title she had earned through years of grueling study at Georgia Tech and a stellar career in the private sector. However, after a bureaucratic reshuffle and the influence of a vindictive commanding officer, she had been relegated to facility maintenance duty. In reality, she was the base janitor tasked with cleaning up the oil spills and debris left behind by the very mechanics who now looked through her as if she were made of glass. Maya had been at Edwards for 6 months, a time defined by quiet observation. She knew every inch of the X-99. While the elite engineers spent their days debating telemetry data and software patches, Maya spent her nights in the dark, silent hangar. She would sit on an overturned crate, just listening. To the untrained ear, the X-99 was silent, but to Maya, the machine possessed a rhythm. She heard the faint, discordant vibration in the secondary fuel pump, a sound so subtle that it couldn't be registered by the high-tech diagnostic sensors that lined the walls of the facility. The crisis had begun 72 hours ago. During a routine pre-flight engine cycle, the X-99's primary turbine had seized. It wasn't a catastrophic explosion. It was a rhythmic, grinding stall that made the entire airframe shudder. Since then, the hangar had become a pressure cooker. 50 of the most decorated engineers in the Air Force, men with PhDs from MIT and decades of experience in supersonic propulsion, had been swarming over the jet. They had disassembled the engine twice, replaced the entire fuel injection rail, and rewritten the ECU software 4 times. Captain Marcus Miller, the lead supervisor of the repair operation, paced the floor like a caged tiger. His face was a map of stress, his forehead beaded with sweat that dripped onto his pristine uniform. He was the man who had ordered Maya's demotion 3 months ago, citing organizational restructuring. He viewed any suggestion that came from someone outside his hand-picked circle of experts as a personal insult. "I don't care what the simulation says," Miller roared, his voice echoing off the corrugated metal ceiling. "The simulation says the compression ratios are perfect. If they are perfect, then why in the hell won't this bird turn over?" A young junior engineer nervously raised a tablet. Sir, we've rescanned the entire intake manifold. Every sensor is reading green. There is literally no mechanical reason for this engine to remain locked. Miller snatched the tablet, his knuckles white. Then find a reason the Joint Chiefs are flying in at 0800 hours tomorrow. If this plane isn't taxied out to the runway for a full engine test by then, every one of our careers is over. Do you hear me? Over. Maya stood 10 feet away, rinsing her mop in a bucket of murky, oil-slicked water. She could feel the vibration of the engine block from here, a dull, thumping resonance that felt like a heartbeat with an arrhythmia. She knew exactly what was wrong. It wasn't in the intake manifold, and it wasn't a software glitch. It was a structural harmonic imbalance in the turbine blades caused by a microscopic misalignment in the thrust-bearing housing. It was a classic textbook problem that had been documented in early 1990s, experimental manuals that Miller and his team had deemed obsolete and tossed into the archives. She took a cautious step forward, her voice soft but steady. Captain Miller, if you increase the static pressure on the bleed air valve by 0.5 psi, it might dampen the vibration in the housing, enough to allow the turbine to clear the seizure. The hangar fell silent. 50 pairs of eyes snapped toward her. The air turned freezing cold. Miller stopped pacing and turned slowly. He looked at Maya, then at her mop, then back at her face, his eyes narrowing into slits. Did I ask for an opinion from the janitor? Miller whispered, his voice dangerously low. No, sir, Maya replied, refusing to look down. But I've been studying the vibration logs and... You've been studying the trash, Miller interrupted, laughing sharply. A few of the mechanics nearby chuckled, their eyes mirroring the captain's disdain. Get back to the latrines, Lawson, before I make sure you aren't just demoted but discharged. Maya tightened her grip on the mop handle. She knew the clock was ticking not just for the X-99, but for her own sanity. Was it worth the humiliation to save a machine that clearly didn't want her? She turned away, but the ghost of her father's voice, a man who had built aircraft in the Jim Crow era with nothing but scrap metal, whispered in her mind. Listen to the machine, Maya. People will lie to you, but metal tells the truth. As she walked towards the supply closet, the engine let out a sharp, metallic clack, a death rattle. The hours crawled by, each one a tightening noose around the neck of the Hangar 12 team. By 2 a.m., the air was thick with the stench of stale coffee, burnt wiring, and the sour sweat of 50 men who had hit a wall. The X-99 Valkyrie loomed over them like a silent, mocking monolith. Miller had not slept, and his patience had evaporated long ago, replaced by a volatile, hair-trigger temper. It's not in the software, Miller screamed, kicking a tool cart that sent a cascade of wrenches clattering across the floor. Check the fuel delivery system again. Strip it down to the bolts. Captain, we've stripped it 3 times. A weary mechanic named Dave responded, his eyes bloodshot. It's clean. The diagnostics are perfect. We're chasing ghosts. Miller grabbed Dave by the collar of his flight suit and shoved him back against the fuselage of the jet. You are not chasing ghosts. You are failing to do your jobs. If this multi-million-dollar asset isn't ready for the general by dawn, I will personally see to it that every one of you is transferred to the most desolate radar outpost in the Arctic Circle. Do I make myself clear? The room fell deathly silent. Nobody dared to breathe. Miller was a man who thrived on fear, and he was currently operating at the peak of his power. He needed a scapegoat, someone to absorb the collective frustration of the team, and he knew exactly where to find one. He turned his gaze, scanning the hangar until it landed on Maya. She was kneeling by a spill near the primary landing gear, methodically wiping the concrete. She was trying to remain invisible, but Miller's hatred was a homing beacon. "Lawson!" he barked, striding over to her. The group of engineers watched, some with pity, others with the cold detachment of people who were glad it wasn't them in the crosshairs. Maya stood up, her back stiff. "Yes, Captain. You think you're smart, don't you?" Miller crowded into her personal space, his face inches from hers. You think that because you have a degree collecting dust in your personnel file, you can walk around here acting like a consultant. You're a janitor. You mop up the filth that we leave behind. That is your purpose. That is your reality. I was just trying to help, sir, Maya said, her voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her. Help. Miller let out a hollow, mocking laugh. You were insulting me. You were implying that I, a man with 20 years of field experience, am being outthought by a woman with a bucket of soapy water. He reached out and grabbed her arm, his grip bruising. I want that floor spotless. And when I say spotless, I mean I want to see my reflection in this concrete. Get on your knees. The room collectively gasped. A few of the younger engineers looked away, unable to stomach the scene, but no one moved to intervene. The hierarchy of the Air Force was a rigid, unforgiving machine, and Miller was the one pulling the levers. Maya hesitated, her jaw tight. Her pride was screaming, but she knew the cost of defiance. She slowly sank to her knees. As she began to scrub, Miller stood over her, tapping his boot against the floor, inches from her hands. Harder. I don't see any shine yet. He watched her with a twisted sense of satisfaction, a cruel glint in his eyes. He leaned down, whispering so only she could hear. You see, Maya, this is your place. No matter how many books you read, or how much you think you know, you will always be down here, and I will always be up there. Don't you ever forget it. As she scrubbed, Maya's eyes tracked the underside of the engine housing. From this vantage point closer to the ground, she could see something the engineers had missed, because they were all standing on elevated platforms. There was a faint, almost invisible discoloration on the heat, shielding a sign of uneven thermal dissipation. It confirmed her theory about the thrust bearing. She had the answer, but it was being held hostage by a man who would rather destroy the plane than let her save it. Suddenly, Miller kicked her bucket, sending gray, oily water sloshing across the floor and over her boots. Clumsy, he sneered. Now you have to start all over again. He turned back to his team, energized by his cruelty. Get back to work. We have 4 hours until the general arrives. If I see one more person standing around doing nothing, I'll have their stripes for breakfast. Maya stayed on her knees, the cold water seeping into her shoes. She looked at her hands, stained, calloused, and shivering from the damp and the humiliation. She wasn't just a janitor. She was a daughter of a man who had been told the same things in the same tone in a different era. She closed her eyes, trying to visualize the engine's internal schematics, mentally bypassing the filters and software layers Miller's team was obsessed with. She had to do something. She couldn't let them ground this bird, and she couldn't let Miller bury her professional life under a pile of lies. But how? How could she prove her worth when the gatekeeper had locked the door and thrown away the key? The sound of Miller's voice continued to drone on a constant abrasive background noise. He was arguing with a frantic supply officer demanding parts that didn't exist. Maya knew they weren't going to fix it. They were going to keep repeating the same mistakes until the sun came up, and their failure was absolute. She looked at her wrench, the one tool she had managed to smuggle into her cleaning cart. It was heavy, worn, and reliable. It was the only thing in this hangar that didn't lie. The hum of the industrial ventilation system sounded like a funeral dirge. Maya stayed on her knees, the dampness of the floor seeping into her uniform, but her mind was light years away from the humiliation Miller had just inflicted. Her eyes were fixed on the underside of the X-99, specifically that subtle heat-scorched patch on the shielding. It was a telltale sign, a signature of thermal fatigue that occurred only when the secondary thrust bearing was misaligned by a fraction of a millimeter. While the elite team continued their frantic, aimless assault on the jet's software, Maya felt like a ghost haunting her own life. To them, she was part of the background, no different than the fire extinguishers or the rolling tool chests. They talked around her, over her, and about her, never suspecting that the janitor was dissecting the most advanced propulsion system on the planet in her head. "The fuel pressure is still spiking," Dave muttered, frustration dripping from his voice as he walked past Maya. "It's like the engine is fighting itself. It's impossible." Maya didn't look up, but she whispered, "It's not the fuel. It's the thrust bearing. It's binding at high RPMs, causing the ECU to misinterpret the load and dump excess pressure into the manifold." Dave stopped, turning back with a confused frown. He looked at Maya, then scanned the room to make sure Miller wasn't watching. "What did you say?" "The thrust bearing," Maya repeated, her voice calm and devoid of malice. "The heat shielding on the undercarriage is showing signs of localized friction. You're trying to solve a mechanical structural failure with a software patch. You're effectively trying to fix a broken leg by updating the patient's medical chart." Dave blinked, his mouth slightly agape. For a fleeting second, the arrogance that usually defined the X-99 project evaporated from his face, replaced by a flicker of professional curiosity. "A binding bearing would have shown up on the load test sensors. We ran 5 of them. Your sensors are calibrated for the standard X-99 baseline," Maya said, finally standing up and wiping her hands on a rag. "But the recent firmware update increased the turbine's peak operational heat by 3%. The housing is expanding just enough to lock the bearing, but not enough to trigger a fault code. It's a ghost in the machine, Dave. You're looking for a binary error in a physical equation." Dave stared at her. He looked at the massive dormant engine, then back at Maya's worn, grease-stained uniform. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, the fear of Miller, the pressure of the upcoming inspection, and the possibility that the person everyone in the hangar had been stepping over for months was the only one who actually understood the machine. "Hey!" Miller's voice tore through the hangar like a thunderclap. Dave jumped instantly, turning his back on Maya and pretending to study a wiring diagram. Miller stalked over, his face flushed with a dark, predatory anger. He had seen them talking. He had seen the familiar dismissive Chris Shiru Dave usually treated the custodial staff vanish for a split second. "What is she doing?" Miller demanded, pointing a gloved finger at Maya. "Why is she still standing in my way? She was just, finishing the floor, Captain," Dave stammered, his eyes darting toward the floor. "She's done," Miller shouted, his voice reaching a pitch that silenced the entire hangar. He walked up to Maya, invading her space until she could smell the stale coffee and aggressive cologne on his breath. "I told you to clean, not to gossip with my engineers. You're distracting them. You're a liability." He reached out and snatched the ID badge hanging from her pocket, ripping the clip so hard it tore the fabric of her shirt. He held the plastic card up, shaking it in her face. "This gives you access to the hangar floor for the sole purpose of maintenance. If I hear you open your mouth regarding this jet one more time, I will have this revoked, and you will be escorted off base in handcuffs for interfering with national security operations. Do you understand?" Maya looked Miller in the eye. She didn't blink. "I understand that you have 4 hours until the general arrives, and you're no closer to fixing this engine than you were 3 days ago." The room fell so silent that the distant ticking of the hangar's wall clock sounded like a drumbeat. Miller's face went pale, then a deep, dangerous purple. He looked like he was about to strike her. His hands trembled not from fear, but from a rage so total it threatened to consume him. "Get out!" Miller hissed, his voice trembling with a terrifying restraint. "Get out of my sight. Go to the locker room. If I see you on this floor before the general leaves, I will make sure you never work in this industry again, not as a janitor, not as a technician, not as anything. You will be blacklisted from every government contract in this country." 2 security guards, already waiting in the wings, as if on cue, stepped forward, their hands on their holsters. They took Maya by the arms. She didn't resist. As they marched her toward the exit, She caught Dave's eye one last time. He looked terrified, trapped between the brilliance of what she had told him and the absolute crushing authority of the man who held his career in his hands. Outside, the California night was cold. The vast desert sky stretched over the base, filled with indifferent stars. Maya was shoved out the service door, the heavy metal slamming shut behind her, with a finality that made her heart sink. She was alone, her pride battered, her professional reputation in tatters, and the only machine she had ever truly loved was minutes away from becoming a permanent monument to human incompetence and ego. She walked toward the small, dimly lit shed that served as the base's storage area, a place she had spent her nights reading her father's old manuals. She sat on the cold concrete step and buried her face in her hands. She thought of her father, a man who had spent 40 years in a segregated workshop, never allowed to touch the planes he helped design because of the color of his skin. He had told her that the world would always try to make her feel small, that the people in power would always try to rewrite her story to suit their own. But he had also told her the truth. Maya is the only thing that cannot be silenced. It just needs a moment to be heard. Inside the hangar, the clock ticked. 3 a.m. The cool night air of the Mojave Desert offered no comfort to Maya as she paced the perimeter of the storage shed. Her mind was a whirlwind of structural schematics and the sound of that sickeningly rhythmic clack echoing inside the X-99. But the physical cold was nothing compared to the freezing isolation she felt. Back inside Hangar 12, the situation had shifted from high pressure to absolute catastrophe. Captain Miller was no longer pacing. He was vibrating with a mania that bordered on total nervous collapse. The arrival of General Vance was now less than 3 hours away, and the X-99 remained a dead husk of carbon fiber and titanium. "Captain, we've tried everything," the lead diagnostic officer, Lieutenant Barnes, said, his voice cracking. "The turbine assembly is structurally sound. There are no loose fasteners, no debris, and the fuel mixture is optimal. The engine simply refuses to engage the ignition sequence." Miller, eyes bloodshot and skin sallow under the harsh fluorescent lights, slammed his fist onto the wing of the jet. "It is a machine. It does not have a soul. It does not choose to be stubborn. It is physics, and physics does not lie." He turned toward the surrounding mechanics, his eyes darting wildly. "Who here is still holding back? Who here is hiding a shortcut? If this plane doesn't fire, I will have every single one of you under a court-martial review for gross incompetence." The air in the hangar was toxic. Miller's leadership had devolved into a reign of terror. He began to systematically dismantle the morale of his team, isolating anyone who showed a hint of doubt. He singled out a veteran engine technician, Sergeant Ramos, who had been with the program since its inception. "Ramos, you've been here since day one," Miller barked, pointing a finger at his chest. "Why is this failing?" Ramos looked at his feet, his face etched with exhaustion. "Captain, we've followed every protocol. Perhaps we need to call in the Engineering Oversight Board from the Pentagon. We need fresh eyes." "Fresh eyes." Miller cut him off, a sickening grin spreading across his face. "You mean like the janitor? The one who talks about bearings as if she's spent a day in a wind tunnel?" Miller turned towards the rest of the team, his voice dripping with condescending venom. "That's what this is, isn't it? You're all waiting for a miracle from the person who handles the trash bins. You think because she's a black woman, there's some hidden wisdom in her mop bucket. You pathetic cowards." He grabbed a heavy steel wrench from a nearby table and marched over to the jet's maintenance port. "I'll show you who knows this engine." He began to hammer at the access panel, his movements frantic and uncoordinated. He wasn't working on the machine. He was attacking it. Sparks flew as he jammed tools into the precision-engineered ports, stripping the delicate titanium threads of the intake manifold. "Captain, stop! You're damaging the casing!" Lieutenant Barnes shouted, reaching out to grab Miller's arm, Miller whipped around his face a mask of rage. He shoved Barnes backward, sending the officer crashing into a rack of sensitive sensors, which toppled over with a deafening glass-shattering roar. The room froze. Nobody dared to breathe. Miller stood there breathing like a dying animal, holding a mangled piece of the manifold in his hand. "I am the lead engineer of this program," Miller screamed at the silent, terrified men. "My authority is absolute. If I say this engine will start, it will start, and if any of you thinks otherwise, you are in direct violation of my orders." He was losing his grip on reality. He grabbed a box of technical files, the official maintenance logs for the X-99, and flung them across the floor. Papers scattered everywhere, a blizzard of data that no one would ever have time to process. "Clean this up," he commanded, pointing at a young technician. "And if anyone mentions the janitor again, I will personally ensure that your next posting is at the bottom of the ocean. This base is under my command, and I will not be undermined by people who don't belong in this hangar." Outside, Maya heard the crash of the falling equipment. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She knew the sound of a breaking engine. She knew the exact noise Miller had just caused by over-torquing the manifold. He had just made the damage permanent. He had turned a precision instrument into a heap of scrap metal. She couldn't take it anymore. The injustice, the professional sabotage, the pure, unadulterated hatred Miller harbored toward everything she represented. It all coalesced into a singular burning resolve. She stood up, brushing the desert dust from her knees. She didn't care about the handcuffs or the threats or the blacklist. She turned and marched toward the hangar. Her gait was purposeful, the stride of someone who was no longer asking for permission, but was coming to claim what was rightfully hers. She walked past the guard booth, her eyes fixed on the massive hangar doors. When the sentry challenged her, she didn't stop. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the worn, grease-stained notebook her father had left her, and held it up like a badge of office. "Move," she said, her voice quiet but possessing an authority that made the guard flinch and step aside. She shoved the service door open and stepped back into the madness of Hangar 12. The sight that greeted her was apocalyptic. Miller was standing on the ladder, his uniform stained with hydraulic fluid, his eyes wide and vacant. The engine was smoking a thin wisp of acrid, burnt plastic gray, swirling into the rafters. The entire team looked at her as she entered. Even Miller, still clutching the ruined manifold, turned to look. He didn't speak. He seemed too far gone to process her presence. "You've killed it," Maya said, her voice clear and carrying through the vast, silent space. She walked past the stunned mechanics, her eyes locked on the smoking intake. "You've completely compromised the secondary housing. You've ruined the turbine alignment, and if you turn that ignition, the whole manifold is going to shred." Miller's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He just stared, his hands still trembling around the tool he had used to destroy the plane. "Get her out of here," Miller finally croaked, but there was no strength in his voice. It was the sound of a man who realized in that moment that he had reached the end of his rope. Maya looked at the team, then at the smoking engine. "I'm not here to talk. I'm here to tell you that you've made a mess. And unless you want this plane to be a permanent paperweight for the next 10 years, you're going to let me fix what you couldn't." The tension in the hangar was no longer just fear. It was the suffocating electric charge of a storm about to break. Every engineer in the room was looking at her not as a janitor, but as the only person standing between them and a military career-ending disaster. The silence in Hangar 12 was so profound that Maya could hear the faint, high-pitched whine of the facility's cooling fans. She stood in the center of the floor, the stark, unforgiving light of the LEDs reflecting off the polished concrete. Miller, still clutching the mangled titanium manifold, looked like a statue of failed ambition. His face was a grayish, sickly pallor, the sweat cooling on his skin, leaving streaks through the grime. I said, "Get her out." Miller's voice lacked its usual roar. It sounded like cracked glass, thin and brittle. He looked toward the security detail, but the guards didn't move. They were staring at Maya, their eyes wide with a mix of shock and a desperate, burgeoning hope. They too were tired of the madness. They were tired of the screaming. Maya didn't acknowledge Miller. She turned her back on him, walking toward the X-99. Every step she took felt like she was reclaiming a part of herself that had been chipped away over the last 3 months. She stopped beneath the turbine where the smoke still curled in lazy, mocking ribbons. She reached into her back pocket and pulled out the worn, oil-stained leather notebook. It was more than a record of measurements. It was her inheritance. As she flipped through the yellowed, brittle pages, the memory of her father, Elijah Lawson, flooded her mind. She saw him sitting in their small, cramped shed in the suburbs of Atlanta, his fingers calloused and blackened by engine carbon, a single flickering bulb hanging overhead. They will call it obsolete engineering. Maya, he had told her, his voice rough with age but steady as a mountain. They will tell you that if it isn't in a digital diagnostic suite, it doesn't exist. But machines have a soul, a rhythm. When you move beyond the software, you find the truth. She remembered how he had taught her to calibrate thrust bearings by touch and sound, not by a digital readout. He had written down the calculations for harmonic imbalances equations that the modern military had deemed unnecessary because they relied on human intuition rather than a sensor array. Maya's fingers traced the precise slanted handwriting. Her father had died without ever being allowed to touch a military-grade jet, his genius confined to fixing rusted farm trucks and lawnmowers, while the men who stole his research climbed the corporate ladder. "What is that?" Lieutenant Barnes asked, stepping closer. His voice was no longer arrogant. It was the voice of a man who was drowning and had just seen a life preserver. Maya looked up, her eyes flashing with a cold, focused intelligence. "This is a record of 1992-era propulsion physics. It's a series of manual adjustments for harmonic resonance that the current X-99 software ignores because it assumes the housing is perfectly static. Your software is designed for a machine that doesn't exist. This notebook is designed for the machine you actually have." Miller stumbled down the ladder, his legs shaking. "It's a lie. It's all a bunch of back-alley, unverified nonsense. You're trying to sabotage this project, Maya. You're trying to make us look like fools. You've already made yourselves look like fools, Captain," Maya said, her voice cutting through his panic like a blade. "Look at your hands. Look at the damage you did to the manifold because you were too proud to stop. You aren't sabotaging the project. You're the one who killed it." She turned to the team. "Who has the torque wrench? Not the electronic one, the manual precision-calibrated one." Ramos, the veteran sergeant, stepped forward immediately. He reached into his toolbox and handed her the heavy chrome-plated tool. As Maya took it, she felt the familiar weight, the weight of a legacy that had been ignored for decades. Miller lunged toward her, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You have no clearance. If you touch that turbine, I will have you arrested for treason." He reached for her, his hands clawing at her shoulders, but before he could reach her, two of the younger mechanics stepped between him and Maya. They didn't hit him. They simply stood like a wall, their bodies rigid and protective. Miller stopped, stumbling back against a tool rack, gasping for air. His face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. He looked around the room, searching for an ally, for someone to back his authority, but he found only backs turned toward him. He had lost them. He had burned every bridge of loyalty he once held, and in the space where his authority used to be there was now only a vacuum filled by Maya's quiet, unshakable resolve. "I'm going to need a dielectric alignment jig and a secondary thermal sealant," Maya instructed, not looking at anyone in particular. "And I need everyone to step back from the diagnostic monitors. If I hear one more beep or alert, I'm walking out." "Clear the floor," Barnes shouted. "You heard her. Shut down the servers, silence the alerts, and give her space." As the team scrambled to follow her orders, the high-tech humming environment of the hangar shifted. The screens went black, one by one. The frantic synthetic noise of the sensors died away, replaced by a sudden heavy quiet. Maya stood before the X-99. She placed her notebook on the workbench, open to the page her father had written 30 years ago. She closed her eyes for a second, inhaling the scent of ozone and hydraulic fluid, the scent of her life's work. She didn't need the software. She didn't need the sensors. She needed to be in tune with the metal, to feel the vibration of the bearing housing, and to adjust it with the precision of a watchmaker. Miller sat on the floor in the corner, his head in his hands, defeated and discarded. The room was no longer his. The jet was no longer his. He was just a man in a dirty uniform watching a woman he had spent months trying to destroy, do the one thing he had proven he could never accomplish. Maya reached into this access port, her fingers finding the internal housing. She felt the slight jagged edges of the metal, the misalignment that the sensors had been too blind to see. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible misalignment, a flaw that required the steady, trained hand of someone who had spent a lifetime listening to the truth. She began to turn the wrench, her movements fluid and rhythmic. Click, click, click. The sound was like a heartbeat. The air inside Hangar 12 felt thin, charged with the kind of electricity that precedes a lightning strike. Maya was deep in her work, her body angled perfectly to reach the internal assembly of the X-99. She was moving with a fluidity that looked like a dance, slow, deliberate, and precise. She wasn't fighting the machine anymore. She was communicating with it. Suddenly, the heavy blast doors at the far end of the hangar creaked open. A heavy, rhythmic sound of military boots echoed against the concrete, a sound that signaled the end of any remaining secrets. It was General Vance, accompanied by his high-ranking security detail and a group of startled civilian observers from the Department of Defense. The room erupted into a frenzy of nervous energy. Miller, sensing a chance to salvage his reputation, scrambled to his feet. He wiped the grease from his face, straightened his jacket, and put on a mask of practiced professional composure. "General Vance, sir," Miller called out, his voice booming with forced confidence. "We were just in the final stages of a critical recalibration. We encountered some unexpected sensor noise, but the integrity of the project remains top priority." General Vance, a man with skin like weathered leather and eyes that seemed to see through walls, didn't even glance at Miller. He walked straight into the center of the hangar, his boots stopping only when he reached the shadow of the jet. He looked at the blacked-out diagnostic screens, then at the team standing in a semicircle around the engine, and finally his gaze settled on Maya, who was still buried deep inside the intake port. "Captain Miller," the general said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "I was told this machine was ready for a full ignition sequence. Why is the floor covered in manuals, and why is your lead technical supervisor standing in the corner while a custodial staff member is inside the turbine housing?" Miller's composure cracked. "Sir, it's a security breach. She's interfering. She's sabotaging the equipment, and my team is trying to contain the situation. Is that right?" Vance looked at Lieutenant Barnes. "Barnes, report." Barnes swallowed hard. He looked at Maya, then at Miller's desperate, panicked face. "With all due respect, General, the captain is lying. We've been failing for 72 hours. We couldn't find the fault. Maya Lawson found the flaw in the thrust-bearing housing in under 10 minutes. The general's eyebrows arched. He turned back to the jet. "Lawson, you have something to say." Maya didn't pull back. She finished the final torque adjustment, a sharp, clear click, and slowly withdrew from the intake port. She wiped her hands on a clean cloth, her face calm, her posture radiating an unshakable dignity. She stood before the general not as a janitor, but as an engineer. "The thrust bearing was misaligned, sir," Maya said, her voice echoing clearly. Captain Miller's team was trying to solve a mechanical fatigue issue with a software update. It wasn't a digital error. It was a structural harmonic imbalance. "And you're qualified to make that assessment?" Vance asked, his voice giving nothing away. "I have a master's in aerospace engineering from Georgia Tech, sir," Maya replied. "And I have 30 years of hands-on experience passed down through my family. I don't need a sensor to tell me when metal is screaming." Miller rushed forward, his face red. "She's a liar. She's been fired. She's disgruntled." "Quiet, Miller!" The general snapped, his voice a whip crack. He looked at his aide, then pointed at the cockpit of the X-99. "I recall this jet was designed with a rather unconventional amenity for the pilot's long-range endurance testing. A specialized pressurized beverage system, correct?" "Yes, sir." The aide nodded. "A high-pressure espresso module for the cockpit. It was integrated into the structural cooling loop." The room went silent. It was a detail so absurd, so clearly a bureaucratic nightmare of engineering gone wrong, that it highlighted the very hubris that had brought the program to its knees. Miller had been so obsessed with data and sensors that he had forgotten the machine he was building was also a pilot's home. Maya looked up at the general. "The espresso module is connected to the secondary cooling loop, sir. When it's engaged, it creates a minor pressure fluctuation in the heat dissipation line. That's why your sensors were green during static tests, but failed during ignition. You were testing it without the module engaged. The vibration I corrected is triggered by the resonance of the coffee pump, which matches the frequency of the bearing housing." The general stared at her, then looked at the cockpit, then back at Maya. A slow, bemused smile spread across his face. "So the most advanced stealth fighter in the U.S. arsenal is being grounded by a coffee maker." "In essence, yes, sir," Maya said. The absurdity of the moment washed over the room. The high-stakes military tension, the screaming captain, the millions of dollars at risk. It all centered on a stupid, over-engineered piece of equipment that no one had ever bothered to account for. "Get out of my sight, Miller," the general said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You're relieved of duty, effective immediately. You will report to the Office of Inspector General at 0900 hours, and bring your records." Miller didn't fight. He didn't yell. The realization of his complete and total collapse hit him like a physical blow. He walked out of the hangar, a defeated hollow man, his shadow stretching long and thin across the concrete floor, a ghost of the authority he had once so cruelly wielded. "Now," the general said, turning to Maya, "you said you fixed the bearing. Let's see if your hands are as good as your words." Maya looked at the team. Ramos, Barnes, and the others were watching her with a newfound respect. She nodded toward the ignition panel. "Start her up," Maya said. The general gave the signal. The technician reached out his hand steady and flipped the ignition switch. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. Then the X-99 let out a deep, resonant growl, not the stuttering, choking death rattle from before, but a clean, powerful, unified roar. The vibration was gone. The engine hummed with the perfect, terrifying efficiency of a predator. The hangar erupted not in cheers, but in a profound, stunned silence. The X-99 was alive, and standing in the middle of it all was a woman in a stained uniform holding a notebook that the world had tried to throw in the trash. The roar of the X-99 Valkyrie wasn't just noise. It was a rhythmic, harmonic pulse that vibrated through the very foundation of Hangar 12. For the first time in 3 days, the hangar wasn't a place of panic. It was a sanctuary of mechanical perfection. General Vance stood near the starboard wing, his eyes fixed on the diagnostic tablets that were now scrolling through streams of steady emerald green data. Every sensor read exactly as it should. The turbine was spinning at optimal velocity, and the heat dissipation was perfectly synchronized. Maya stood back, her hands tucked into the pockets of her oversized maintenance uniform. She was exhausted, the kind of deep bone-weary fatigue that only comes after hours of intense mental and physical exertion. But beneath the tiredness there was a steady, quiet pride. She hadn't just saved a jet. She had vindicated her father. Unbelievable, Lieutenant Barnes whispered, stepping toward the engine housing. He looked at Maya, his expression a mix of shame and genuine awe. You adjusted the bearing housing by how much a micron to? 0.04 millimeters, Maya replied, her voice steady. And I balanced the load against the coffee module's pump resonance. If the system isn't tuned to account for the vibration of the auxiliary components, the entire structural load path shifts. It's not just about the engine. It's about the integration of every single piece of metal on that frame. The general turned his sharp eyes, scanning the room before landing on Maya. You understand more about this machine than the men who designed it, Lawson. And yet I find you in a position that requires a mop instead of a calibration tool. Institutional inertia is a powerful thing, General, Maya said, her tone neither accusing nor subservient. Sometimes it's easier to ignore the person on the floor than to admit the system is blind. The hangar was filled with the team members, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the monitor banks. They were no longer the arrogant, condescending elite who had mocked her hours before. They looked like students who had just witnessed a lecture from a master. I need to know one more thing, Vance said, stepping closer. Why did you stay? You could have left. You could have walked out of this base the moment Miller humiliated you. You were mistreated, harassed, and actively sabotaged. Why fight for a program that didn't want you? Maya looked at the X-99, its stealth skin shimmering under the overhead lights. Because this isn't just a military asset, General. It's a miracle of engineering. My father spent his life watching other men take credit for his ideas because he was told he didn't belong in the workshop. I didn't stay for the program. I stayed because I refused to let the truth be buried under anyone else's ego. At that moment, the back door of the hangar opened, and a group of military police entered, escorting a disheveled and frantic Miller back inside. He had been intercepted before he could leave the base. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. His shoulders were slumped, his tie hung loose, and his eyes were hollow. General, please, Miller stammered, ignoring the guards. There was a malfunction in the diagnostic suite. I was under immense pressure. I've been leading this team for years. You've been presiding over a decline, Miller. Vance cut him off, his voice cold enough to freeze blood. You let your prejudice blind you to a critical mechanical failure. You endangered the pilot, you wasted millions in taxpayer funds, and you broke the professional chain of command by abusing a subordinate. You're not just a failure as an engineer. You're a failure as an officer. Miller looked around the room, desperately seeking a shred of sympathy, but he found none. Even the technicians who had once feared his wrath were now looking at him with open contempt. Get him to the brig, Vance commanded, and have the legal team prepare the documentation for a full review of his conduct. I want every decision he's made in the last year audited. As the guards led Miller away, he didn't scream. He didn't fight. He simply stared at Maya. For a brief flickering moment, he looked into her eyes, and there was a terrifying realization there, the realization that his entire worldview had been shattered by the one person he had deemed invisible. As he passed her, Maya didn't look away. She held his gaze until he was dragged out the door, his shadow vanishing into the corridor. The general turned back to Maya, his demeanor shifting to one of quiet, professional focus. Lawson, I'm putting you in charge of the final integration tests. I want you to review the entire software suite against the hardware limitations you identified. Can you do that? Yes, sir, Maya said. Good. And for the record, Vance paused, a slight smile touching his lips. I'll make sure the engineering board knows exactly who saved this flight. You aren't a janitor, Maya. You're the lead engine specialist starting now." A murmur of approval rippled through the room. Ramos, the veteran sergeant, stepped forward and extended his hand. "I'm sorry, Maya, for everything. We were wrong. Every single one of us." Maya shook his hand. It was a firm, grounding gesture. She felt the calluses on his palm, the same ones she had. "Let's get back to work," she said, her voice filled with a new authoritative energy. "We have a flight test in 2 hours, and I want to make sure every single component, including that ridiculous espresso machine, is perfectly balanced." The hangar, which had been a place of despair, was now buzzing with a renewed sense of purpose. Men who had been at each other's throats only hours ago were now communicating with precision and respect. The hierarchy had been reset. The meritocracy had returned. But even in the midst of the activity, Maya found a moment of stillness. She walked over to the workbench and closed her father's notebook. She felt a profound sense of peace. The ghost of the man who had been kept in the shed was now in a way standing right there in the heart of the most advanced hangar in the world. She looked up at the ceiling, at the vast complex web of cranes and sensors. She had done it. She had forced the door open, and she had done it not by shouting, but by being undeniable. The general watched her from the periphery, his arms crossed. He knew he was looking at the future of the program. "Keep an eye on her," he whispered to his aide. "She's the kind of person who changes history without even trying." The countdown to the flight test began with a gravity that felt heavier than the hours preceding it. The hangar was no longer a cage. It was a pressurized cockpit of focused energy. Every technician, every engineer, and every support staff member now moved with a purpose that had been absent for the past 3 days. There was no longer any ego, no hierarchy of intimidation, just the raw, grinding reality of aviation physics. Maya walked the perimeter of the X-99, her notebook tucked safely into her pocket. She was no longer wearing the oversized, grime-streaked custodial coveralls. General Vance had personally seen to it that she was issued a clean-fitted flight line technician's suit. It felt like armor. "System check at 80%. Lieutenant Barnes called out from the diagnostic console. His voice was no longer frantic. It was sharp, professional, and entirely focused on the data. "Turbine resonance is holding steady at 0.01 decibels. The secondary thrust bearing is tracking perfectly. Maintain the pressure on the bleed air valve," Maya instructed, walking toward the primary intake. "And ensure the espresso module's auxiliary coolant pump is set to a constant duty cycle. We can't afford any spikes in the load path while we're testing the transition to supersonic flight." Ramos, the veteran sergeant, looked up from his station with a faint, respectful smile. "You heard her. Lock it in." The atmosphere was electric. The high-tech, sensory-heavy environment that had once been Maya's enemy was now her instrument. She navigated the complex arrays of the X-99 with a grace that was mesmerizing. She was checking the physical, tactile connections, the things the computers couldn't simulate. She checked the torque on the external mounting bolts, the tension of the hydraulic lines, and the microscopic clearances of the heat, shielding she had identified as the root of the problem. General Vance stood on the raised observation deck, watching the process unfold. He hadn't left since Miller was removed. He was witnessing a transformation. He saw a team that had been broken, arrogant, and paralyzed by fear suddenly coalesce into a unit of extreme precision. And at the center of it, orchestrating the harmony, was the woman they had spent months treating as an invisible servant. "Ready for ignition," Ramos signaled, looking up at Maya for final approval. Maya stood directly in front of the massive engine intake. She closed her eyes. She needed to feel the startup cycle. She needed to know that the mechanical heartbeat she had restored was steady. "Initiate startup sequence," she said. The hangar went dead silent. Even the cooling fans seemed to slow down. The technician at the console pressed the ignition sequence. The X-99 didn't just start, it breathed. A low, guttural thrumming sound began to emanate from the turbine, a deep, rhythmic vibration that felt like a pulse. It was the sound of air being compressed and ignited with absolute terrifying efficiency. The engine climbed through the ignition phases, each stage smoother than the last. The temperature gauges stayed in the perfect middle-tier green zone. There were no stutters, no grinding thuds, and no warning alerts. The engine reached full idle, and the sound was a resonant melodic hum, a song of pure, unadulterated power. "Pressure readings are textbook," Barnes announced, his voice filled with genuine wonder. "I've never seen a turbine run this clean. Even the simulations couldn't account for this level of stability." Maya walked toward the monitor bank. She looked at the telemetry, a beautiful, unchanging line of stability. The impossible problem that had baffled 50 experts for 72 hours had been neutralized by someone who understood that the machine didn't just need data, it needed to be heard. "Full power test," Maya said. The technician pushed the throttle forward. The hangar walls began to tremble. The sound escalated from a hum to a roar, a wall of pure energy that pushed the air back against the hangar doors. Outside, the desert dust began to swirl, caught in the wake of the engine's exhaust. The X-99 didn't just run. It roared with a defiance that seemed to echo through the entire base. General Vance walked down from the observation deck, his expression unreadable. He approached the engine, standing just feet away from the intake. He looked at Maya, who was watching the gauges with the intensity of a surgeon. "You've done it, Lawson," the general said, his voice barely audible over the thunder of the turbine. "You've done more than fix a jet. You've exposed the rot in this facility." "It wasn't rot, General," Maya replied, keeping her eyes on the performance charts. "It was just a lack of perspective. When you stop looking at people, you stop seeing the solutions they can offer." As the engine slowed back to an idle, the silence that followed felt heavy, laden with the weight of change. The technicians stood by their stations, looking at Maya with a mix of awe and a quiet, profound shame. They had been the ones to stay silent when Miller had humiliated her. They had been the ones to look away. Now they were the ones who had to live with the knowledge of how close they had come to failing because of their own ingrained, senseless prejudice. Ramos walked over to the workbench where Maya's notebook still sat. He picked it up gingerly, as if it were a sacred artifact. He looked at the handwritten formulas, the diagrams of components that had been outdated for decades, and the slanting, careful script of a man who had been denied his own potential. "This is better than any manual in the fleet," Ramos said, his voice thick with emotion. "You kept this secret. You let us treat you like a janitor while you carried the answer to everything we were failing at." "I didn't keep it a secret," Maya said, taking the notebook back and tucking it into her pocket. "I was waiting for someone to be humble enough to ask." The general signaled to his aide. A team of logistics officers entered the hangar carrying crates of upgraded diagnostic equipment and a set of official engineering credentials branded with the insignia of the base's high command. "Lawson," the general said, stepping into her space. "The investigation into Miller's tenure will take months, but we don't have months. We have a flight schedule. And starting now, you're not just a technician. You're the lead consultant for the entire Valkyrie propulsion program. You have full access, full budget, and full authority." Maya looked at the team, then at the massive roaring engine, and finally at the general. She had come here to mop floors and survive. She was leaving with the keys to the kingdom. But more importantly, she was leaving with the knowledge that she hadn't just changed her own life, she had forced an entire organization to look in the mirror and acknowledge the genius they had been trampling upon. The miracle wasn't the wrench. It wasn't the notebook. The miracle was that she had been strong enough to stand on her knees, waiting for the moment when the world would finally be forced to listen. The morning sun bled over the horizon of the Mojave Desert, casting long, dramatic shadows against the reinforced concrete of Hangar 12. For the team that had spent 3 days in a crucible of failure, the dawn brought more than just light. It brought a stark, sobering clarity. The X-99 Valkyrie sat on the tarmac, its sleek, angular frame shimmering in the early rays, a masterpiece of human ingenuity finally humming with the heartbeat Maya Lawson had restored. The investigation into Marcus Miller's conduct did not take months, it took days. With the general's full backing and the mountain of testimony from every technician in the hangar, Miller's career was dismantled with the same ruthless efficiency he had once used to intimidate his subordinates. He was stripped of his rank and escorted off the base in a military police cruiser, his name scrubbed from the project files, as if he were a corrupted data packet being deleted from the system. He became a cautionary tale, a ghost of the old guard who had believed that status was a substitute for substance. But the real transformation was not in the removal of a tyrant. It was in the fundamental shift of the culture he left behind. 6 months later, Hangar 12 had become a different world. It was a place of intellectual rigor and mutual respect. Under Maya's leadership as the lead propulsion specialist, the team had implemented a new protocol, one that mandated that every technician, regardless of rank or background, had the authority to call a halt to any process if they identified a discrepancy. The janitors were no longer invisible. They were integrated into the diagnostic meetings. The handbook had been updated to include the principles Maya had preserved from her father's notebook, proving that brilliance was not bound by the date on a manual or the pedigree of an institution. The story of the janitor who saved the Valkyrie didn't stay confined to Edwards Air Force Base. It leaked, as truths always do. It traveled through military channels, reached the desk of the Secretary of the Air Force, and eventually found its way to the public. The media storm was immediate. Headlines spanned the globe praising the woman who had used nothing but a wrench and a lifetime of hard-won wisdom to do what 50 of the world's most expensive experts could not. Maya sat in her new office, a glass-walled space overlooking the flight line, and watched a group of young interns, a diverse mix of men and women, from every walk of life meticulously inspecting the engine housing. Among them was the daughter of a custodial worker who had previously been discouraged from applying to the engineering program. Maya had personally mentored her. The door was no longer just open. It was being held wide, and for the first time in the history of the base, the people who actually understood the machines were being listened to regardless of how they looked or what title they held. The Elijah Lawson Foundation was established that same year. Funded by the military's own innovation grant, it provided scholarships and training for brilliant minds from marginalized communities. The kids who, like Maya, were told they didn't belong in the workshop. It was the legacy she had fought for, a world where no genius would ever again have to die in a shed waiting for a chance that never came. As Maya walked out onto the tarmac to watch the X-99 take off for its inaugural mission, she caught the eye of the pilot. He gave her a sharp, respectful salute. She returned it, feeling the weight of the moment. She had proven that dignity was not something you were given by an authority. It was something you carried within yourself until the world was finally forced to acknowledge it. She didn't miss the mop bucket. She didn't miss the cold, damp nights in the storage shed. But she kept the old, grease-stained notebook on her desk. It remained open, a constant reminder that the most sophisticated technology in the world was only as good as the hands that touched it and the ears that were willing to listen. The justice she had sought wasn't just the firing of a man who had wronged her. It was the creation of a system that would never allow his kind of hatred to thrive again. She had not only fixed an engine, she had fixed the machine of the institution itself. True power is not found in a title, a uniform, or the ability to intimidate others. It is found in the quiet, undeniable weight of your own competence and the dignity you refuse to surrender even in the darkest of rooms. Credentials may grant you a seat at the table, but character and truth are what command the room. Never let anyone define your potential by your position. Real talent doesn't shout, it delivers results. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who is currently being overlooked or undervalued. You never know who just needs to be heard. Comment your thoughts on what true merit means to you below, and subscribe to be part of a community that believes in the power of the truth.